Champagne fizzed and slid down the front of her ivory dress like a stain that would not be forgiven. The hall smelled of polished oak and citrus-scented candles, chandeliers throwing diamonds of light across faces that never quite relaxed. It was the foundation gala, the night when invitations and fortunes translated into influence, and everyone who mattered had a seat at the long central table. At the head, Sarah Winslow smiled as if the small disaster had been choreographed for her amusement. She did not reach for a napkin or mutter an apology. She leaned in, voice low and cold, and turned a spill into judgment. The waiter, hands still trembling, tried to pat the fabric with a napkin. Naomi Ellis, who had been carrying a tray of canapés, stepped forward before she was asked. "Let me," she said, fingers gentle, voice steady. Sarah cut across her with a slow laugh that left the room rigid. "Oh, honey, that is not what these events are for," she said, so that those nearest could hear, the words chosen to wound and to remind. Around them, conversation snagged, guests shifted in designer gowns and tailored suits, and someone at a corner table, Julian Price, raised an eyebrow and then looked away. The scene read like a small ritual of exclusion, practiced and efficient. Naomi was not a server by accident. She was 30, pragmatic, the kind of person who could balance a tray and a budget spreadsheet with equal calm. She had taken the evening shift to pay back a student loan and to keep a community legal clinic afloat. And in her bag under the coat rack, there was a folder of case notes and a small recorder she kept for client interviews. Her hands smelled faintly of lemon from the sanitizing cloth and of the soap she used after late nights at the clinic. She straightened the gown as best she could, and her throat made a soft sound that could have been apology or endurance. What no one in the room noticed was that she pressed the recorder against her palm, an impulsive habit born of long days documenting truth. What Sarah did not know was that Naomi had a way of turning small indignities into evidence. In the space between the clink of crystal and the polite coughs from nearby tables, the recorder caught the next sentence, the one that would travel further than anyone imagined. "People like her do not belong at our events," Sarah said, a sentence smooth as silk and rough as acid. The words settled over the room like smoke. Someone at the next table, Emma Collins, a trustee with a notoriously thin smile, swallowed and shifted in discomfort. Naomi kept her face composed and let the device keep listening, the red light hidden behind the seam of a pocket. If you think a single sentence at a glittering gala is harmless, wait until you hear how it reverberates. The recording would not. It would name a prejudice in public, it would name a person, and once amplified, it would make institutions account for what they tolerated in quiet corners. We have the audio and corroborating witness statements, and as we go through this story, you will hear the words that started a cascade. Let us return to the exact moment the evening tilted. The tray clattered into silence as voices tightened and a ripple of judgment moved across the table like a current. "Do you expect us to host this?" Sarah asked, eyes on Naomi with a look that meant exclusion. "There are standards here." Naomi cleaned at the champagne mark with an economy of motion. "I'm sorry about the spill," she said. "I will pay for dry cleaning." Sarah laughed, a small, precise laugh. "No, you will not. You will stay in your lane." A man across the room, Marco Rivera, an investment donor, stared at his napkin as if the pattern on the cloth could absolve him of noticing. "We all work here," Naomi replied, quiet but firm. Sarah's smile narrowed, and she leaned toward Charles Winslow, her husband, who was adjusting a cufflink that flashed like a private light. "Maybe we need to be more careful about whom we allow to mingle with our guests," she said, like a brand statement. "Are you accusing me of something I did not do?" Naomi asked. "No, I am pointing out reality," Sarah said. "Some people simply do not have the cultivation necessary for this room." Julian Price at the corner table cleared his throat awkwardly. "None of us want trouble," he offered, attempting to stoop into neutrality. Trouble is very bad for the fund, added Eleanor Graves, head of events, fingers tightening around a program. Naomi blinked slowly, refused to be theatrically humiliated. I have worked here 2 years, she said. I have never had an issue before. Emma Collins, who had smiled earlier, shifted her weight and offered Naomi a quick, almost invisible glance that registered discomfort and nothing more. The sequence unfolded like a lecture delivered in pearls, and the audience performed its part. Some leaned closer to hear the gossip, others pretended not to. Security guard Vincent stood near the back, hands folded, absorbing the scene with a man used to diffusing arguments. Pastor David Chen, who had come as an honored guest, murmured the word community as if it might remedy the chemistry. None of them spoke up for Naomi, except a volunteer named Lydia Park, who whispered, "You should save that, Naomi," and slipped the word in under the conversation like a small life preserver. That whisper might have been lost but for the recorder pressed into Naomi's palm. Moment of tension 1. The exact moment a chant of social power met a quiet resistance. The room held its breath, the chandeliers seemed to dim, and Naomi's quiet refusal became louder than Sarah's sneer. The voices around them were soft and dangerous, like puffed embers that could ignite rumor. People looked at their programs as if the printed names could protect them. The air tasted of lemon oil and old perfume, and Naomi felt a surge of something that was not shame, but strategy. For a beat, the entire gala was a courtroom without a judge, and the recorder was a single witness. After that night, Naomi did not simply go home. She had a backstory that explained why she would not let this moment be forgotten, a story that built her resolve in 3 parts. She had grown up in a house where her mother, Anna, taught community classes about tenant rights at their kitchen table, the aroma of rice and black coffee forming the soundtrack of rulebooks and bills. Naomi learned to place letters in envelopes and to argue a point at age 10, voice steady while neighbors listened because her facts were clear. She studied sociology on scholarships, always working at night shifts. Smell of printer ink and bleach forming constellations of effort in her memory. In college, she volunteered at a legal clinic and fell into the rhythm of documenting testimony and filing appeals, learning to listen for the truth beneath the apology. She slept on couches and ate late dinners with classmates, the taste of cheap noodles and the squeak of library chairs woven into her determination. She learned tech skills out of necessity, recording interviews on small devices and transcribing them into cases that helped families keep homes. Her hands developed a dexterity for both empathy and paperwork, paced by the smell of coffee and the burn of reading lamps. When Naomi moved back home, she became the point person for a neighborhood coalition that negotiated with developers, the kind of person who could convene a meeting and make sure every voice was heard. She wore practical shoes, a patched winter coat, and kept the names of city council aides in her phone for nights when someone needed help quickly. Her reputation in the community was quiet but real, built on service and a stubborn competence that no gala could vaporize. These paragraphs are not anecdotes. They are the scaffolding of why she did not accept the humiliation as final. She carried those skills into the job at the foundation, where she worked part-time managing volunteer schedules, learning the formal names of donors and the rituals that kept money moving through noble causes. She learned the language of grant proposals, the smell of vellum envelopes in the director's office, and the rhythm of polite deference. When humiliation happened in the ballroom, she pressed play on the small recorder because she had trained herself to preserve minutes, names, and tones, the raw material of accountability. The next day, the recording waited with her in a small legal folder. She listened to Sarah's sentence again, to the exact cadence of dismissal, and something crystallized. Naomi took a breath that smelled of midday coffee and rain and reached out. To Lydia Park, who worked on the Foundation communications team. Lydia had been the one who whispered at the gala. "We should consider a formal complaint," Lydia said, careful, eyes avoiding the memory of the room. But you will need corroboration. Naomi had already thought of that. I have it, she said. I recorded the interaction. Lydia looked at her with a mixture of admiration and fear. If we go public, this will fracture more than the gala, Lydia warned. There are donors who will be upset. Naomi felt the old training stir. Justice is not comfortable, she said. Neither is silence. Scene of revelation, when competence overturns assumption. Naomi met with Karen O'Neill, head of human resources, and presented the audio on a laptop. The office smelled of coffee and optimism, and Karen listened with a jaw that set like a gate. This is clear evidence of discriminatory language, Karen said. We have to follow policy. Charles Winslow, Sarah's husband, was copied on the initial note as a courtesy. He read the transcript in the quiet of his library, the leather scent and the faint citrus of a diffuser around him. He frowned at the phrasing and at the smallness of the language. I do not recall her speaking like that, he told his assistant, voice low and incredulous. The assistant, Marco, looked down at his hands, unsure whether confidentiality or loyalty came first. The documentation was precise and technical, and it deserves a short explanation. Naomi's recorder captured uncompressed audio in WAV format, metadata showing timestamp and location, and Lydia exported the file into a secure folder with chained receipts and hashing that proved it was not tampered with, a digital certificate that made the recording admissible to the Foundation's review board. The chain of custody and the technical hash were cataloged in a short memorandum that HR attached to the complaint. The private proposal came next, and it was the kind of offer that exposes character. Sarah asks Naomi to meet in the quieter lounge off the main hall, the carpeted room smelling of almonds and old money. The dialogue between them stretched like a taut wire. I do not know why you think you had to record me, Sarah began, voice silk undercut with anger. You humiliated me in front of friends. Naomi answered, You humiliated me in front of colleagues and donors. That is not the same thing. You could make this go away, Sarah said, eyes cold. I can help you. My husband is a majority donor. He can arrange a position at our foundation. It could be good for you. Naomi blinked. Is that an apology or a purchase? She asked. Sarah's face went still. It is an opportunity, she said. You could rise out of your station with proper guidance. The room hummed with the scent of varnish and marble, and Naomi felt the old ledger of favors shifting. Are you offering me a role or asking me to keep quiet? Naomi asked. Both, Sarah said, and you would do very well. Naomi put the recorder on the small table between them, invisible under the lamp's pool of light. No, she said simply, I will not exchange my integrity for a title. Sarah's eyes flashed and she leaned forward. You are making a mistake, she whispered. People like your kind know their places. The words landed like cold stones. Naomi rose, feeling the soles of her shoes against the thick carpet, her breath steady. Then we will resolve this the right way, she said. Moment of tension too, the private offer that smelled like bribery. The lounge air seemed suddenly thin and hot, like a chamber where decisions become knives. Naomi felt the weight of every person who had ever depended on her, the smell of printer toner and take-out dinners mingling with the rarefied perfume of Sarah's world. She left the room with the firm knowledge that she could not accept a compromise that erased the truth. Naomi brought the recording to an ally no one expected to pick a side, Charles Winslow, the millionaire husband who had always been presented as aloof and quietly influential. He listened in his study with a slow frown, an expression that suggested he had never believed himself blind to his wife's temperament. I cannot defend those words, he said finally, voice stripped of social veneer. I have never wanted our name attached to bigotry. His reaction was the pivot. He contacted the board and demanded an internal review, not out of charity alone, but out of concern for reputational risk. The board convened, and the headlines, which had been waiting like a storm front, began to form. The leak happened when a junior communications intern named Marco, overwhelmed and misled about transparency, forwarded a sanitized summary of the complaint to a friend at a local paper. The summary did not include the audio, but once the story was in motion, a freelance reporter named Lydia Park pursued the source. Social feeds, hungry for scandal, amplified excerpts, and the recording found its way, through a cascade of contacts and ethical lapses, into the public sphere. The first headline read, "City Foundation rocked by derogatory remarks from a major donor's wife," and within hours it was on radio and morning shows. Emma Collins, who had been silent that night, called Naomi with a tremor in her voice. "I am so sorry," she said. "We did not do enough." The list of secondary characters who answered publicly within days included Julian Price, who issued a statement of regret, Eleanor Graves, who announced an audit, Pastor David Chen, who called for a community forum, Vincent, who attested to seeing the incident, Marco Rivera, who resigned from a donor committee, and Karen O'Neill, who launched an internal investigation. Moment of tension 3, the moment the private slip became public fury. Headlines multiplied, and the city felt as if a powder keg of complacency had been lit. Naomi's phone buzzed with emails, offers of support, and also threats. Her inbox filled with everything from gratitude to rage. The air tasted like rain and bitter coffee, and she saw in every notification a tiny measure of what had been at stake. The public reaction forced institutions to choose. The foundation announced an immediate external audit led by Helena Stone, a respected investigator from a nonprofit oversight group. Donations were paused, a gala sponsor pulled out, and the board scheduled an emergency meeting. Sarah issued a statement that tried to blend regret and deflection, but the audio existed, and public memory has little patience for gilded nuance when evidence is clear. Charles Winslow, whose disbelief turned into public contrition, stepped forward with a pledge to fund diversity initiatives and to sit with the board until policy changes were made. The newsroom cycle named names, and an op-ed penned by Pastor David Chen asked if the real scandal was not a word, but a system that allowed such words to go unchallenged. Inside the foundation, meetings smelled of stale coffee and nervous perfume. Karen O'Neill handled witness interviews, taking contemporaneous notes that would later be part of the public report. Lydia Park, the communications volunteer who had whispered at the gala, became a key witness and an ally, offering context about the culture of silence she had observed. Helena Stone's audit described a pattern of exclusion in donor events, and her recommendations read like blueprints for repair. They proposed mandatory bias training, a transparent complaint process, and a donor code of conduct with real consequences. The board voted to suspend Sarah from trustee duties pending a review and to open a partnership with the neighborhood coalition Naomi had long worked with. The resulting institutional changes were precise and, at first, awkward. Donor agreements were rewritten to include behavior clauses, HR received funding to expand a hotline and to provide independent investigators, and the foundation created a small grants program that Naomi helped design. She was invited to co-chair a new council on inclusion, not as a ceremonial gesture, but because the board recognized that feasible reforms required practitioners who had lived the work. Naomi smelled the tang of new ink on policy documents, the bright smell of possibility, and the fatigue of long meetings. She negotiated terms that included funding for the legal clinic she had left behind and an independent oversight panel with seats for community representatives. The community reaction was varied. Marco Rivera issued a public apology and donated to the clinic. Julian Price hosted a listening session with neighborhood leaders. Eleanor Graves resigned from events leadership and recommended a successor with a background in community organizing. Pastor David Chen started a citywide forum on belonging, and Emma Collins set up a donor education series. The names and actions multiplied, and the narrative shifted from a single humiliation to a conversation about systems of exclusion and the cost of silence. The audit report, which Naomi read on the Sunday morning with a cup of coffee cooling beside her chair, included specific findings and a timeline of recommendations, technical in places and human in others, the kind of document that reads as both diagnosis and instruction. There were legal conversations as well. Naomi received offers from civil rights groups and from a small legal team willing to help if she chose to pursue formal charges. She consulted with attorneys who explained the limits and possibilities, the procedural vocabulary smelling faintly of law libraries and typed briefs. She was careful, opting for a restorative approach inside the foundation while keeping channels open for legal recourse. The board implemented a transparent mechanism for reporting future incidents, and Helena Stone's oversight remained active for 6 months. 1 month later, the foundation published its public response and a plan of action, accompanied by a modest but clear series of reforms. Donors were asked to sign the new code and to participate in training. Charles Winslow met with community leaders and pledged a research fund. Public tone had shifted from scandal to accountability, and Naomi received an outpouring of messages from people who recognized themselves in the moment she endured. 3 months later, a new director of community partnerships was hired, with Naomi on the selection panel, and the clinic that Naomi supported received emergency funding that stabilized several cases. 6 months later, the foundation reported increased participation from neighborhood organizations, a measurable rise in funds allocated to equitable programs, and an independent oversight note that the institution had begun to change culture. The personal consequences were complex. Naomi was offered a paid position to lead community engagement at the foundation, a role she accepted with conditions that ensured autonomy and community voice. Her inbox included offers to speak on panels and to consult, and she took a few, scheduling them between clinic hours and new program meetings. Sarah issued a private apology to the foundation, and the suspension became a resignation once donors and trustees made clear that the relationship was unsustainable. Charles Winslow established a scholarship fund in Naomi's community name, an ironic gesture that nonetheless provided resources and a platform for further work. There was gratitude and there was fatigue, the two smells often found together after a long campaign for change. Naomi continued to sleep in the modest apartment where the smell of rice and coffee reminded her of origin and endurance. She attended meetings with Helena Stone and with neighborhood leaders, and she ensured the clinic received ongoing funding. The oversight panel published quarterly updates, and the foundation's board minutes showed a pattern of continuous improvement and accountability. Epilogue, 1 month later, looked like this, and the page smelled of the new ink of policy. The foundation had announced the first round of training, donor agreements were rewritten, and Naomi had attended her first committee meeting as co-chair, feeling the pressure and the worth of stewardship. 3 months later, community clinics reported an increase in pro bono assistance, and the foundation's small grants had funded 10 neighborhood projects. Public conversations shifted from gossip about the gala to models of accountability that other nonprofits began to study. 6 months later, independent auditors noted cultural changes and recommended embedding community seats permanently into oversight roles. The Winslow name remained in the papers, but connected to a redemption narrative shaped by tangible giving and public contrition. Naomi continued to lead. The clinic she loved was stable, and the city had a new conversation about power and responsibility. If there is a single lesson from this story, it is not that one recording alone will dismantle inequality, but that evidence, combined with courage and institutional will, can redirect resources and attention. The best response to being overlooked is to build structures that make overlooking harder. If this story moved you, please join the conversation. Share in the comments a moment when you saw someone stand up. Start your reply with, "I have seen" or "I have not," and tell us briefly what happened and how it changed you. Your words matter. They hold community weight, and they help us map patterns that deserve public attention. If you value reporting that ties individual courage to institutional change, subscribe to stay updated on follow-ups and ongoing audits. There will be updates and deeper dives into the documents and procedures that shaped the outcome, and your participation helps make these stories more than isolated outrages. At the end of the day, the ivory dress was a symbol, but the change that followed was concrete. The recording that started as a quiet witness became a public ledger. Corporate policies were rewritten. An entire fundraising culture adjusted its expectations. Naomi kept her humility and added to it a seat at the table where decisions were made. The sound of her voice now part of committee minutes and grant memos.
Sarah lost her trustee seat and the easy assumption of social impunity. Charles, surprised and chastened, used his leverage to fund systems change. The community regained resources and dignity. If you believe accountability is possible when truths are documented, subscribe and tell someone about this case. Transforming humiliation into institutional repair is slow and often messy, but it is also possible. This is the kind of story where evidence and courage converge, and where a recorded sentence becomes the hinge on which policy and practice turn.